We want to begin with some breaking news inside the Justice Department and another explosive and unusual development. NBC News reporting Attorney General William Barr tapped an outside prosecutor to review Trump aide Michael Flynn's case. Now, sources are saying the investigation could be aimed at several former officials Trump has repeatedly criticized publicly. And this highly unusual move from Barr coming after he publicly said convicted Trump aide Roger Stone should have his sentence reduced. We are seeing a pattern from Barr that is beginning to emerge here, essentially questioning anyone who tried to investigate Trump or his political allies. The New York Times reporting Barr is installing outside prosecutors to review anything, quote, politically sensitive. And they started grilling line prosecutors in the Washington office about various cases. And now Trump's allies in Congress are doing exactly the same thing, leveraging the powers of government to help their friends and hurt their political enemies. Barr tapped John Durham to investigate the investigators. You remember that. And then Senator Lindsey Graham, he is now demanding DOJ employees interview with the Senate Judiciary Committee about the Russia investigation. Today, Trump bluntly saying he can interfere in whatever criminal probe he wants. And Trump's attack on the rule of law, well, as you can imagine, that has been a constant.
The entire thing has been a witch hunt.
They should be looking at all these FBI guys who got fired and demoted.
Everybody sees what's going on in the Justice Department. I always put justice now with quotes. We have the worst laws of any country anywhere in the world. James Comey was unfair to the people of this country. I think what he did was a disgrace.
All these investigators, they're Democrats.
To be honest with you, I have to get rid of judges. We're bucking a court system that never, ever rules for us.
I think Bruce Orr is a disgrace, and Mr. Mueller has a lot of conflicts also.
Many people have said you should fire him. On the Department of Justice, I would stay uninvolved. Now, I may get involved at some point if it gets worse.
All right, with me now is the NBC News reporter who broke the Flynn story for us, Carol Lee. Carol, good to have you with us. Let's start with some basics. And I know this may sound like a hard question, but do we have any insight whatsoever as to why the Attorney General, William Barr, is doing this and doing this now?
Well, Eamon, what we know is that the Attorney General asked the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Missouri to look into the Flynn case, specifically at Flynn's FBI interview, which is at the center of his case. With his FBI interview, that's where he pled guilty to lying to investigators in a cooperation deal with Robert Mueller. And he has since said he wants to withdraw that plea, and he didn't lie during that interview. But it comes at a time when Michael Flynn is really challenging the prosecutors in this case, saying that he didn't do this, that there was something untoward that happened with his case. At the same time that the president is saying that Michael Flynn has gotten a raw deal. And also, a lot of focus has been on the Roger Stone sentencing that happened this week. But a very similar thing happened in the Flynn case last month, where prosecutors put forward a sentencing recommendation that included perhaps some jail time for Flynn, and the Justice Department, senior officials at the Justice Department then applied pressure to the prosecutors, and ultimately that sentencing was reversed, and they said, actually, no, probation would be fine. So the issue with this investigation into Flynn is that to observers, it looks like it's an attempt by the Attorney General to get another bite at the apple in terms of the various individuals who are involved in the Flynn case. And they go back to James Comey, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, people that President Trump has really targeted and said should face their own criminal penalties and have not. And so there's a number of questions surrounding this inquiry, what the goals are, when it would finish, and we just don't know exactly what the answers are just yet.
So, Carol, let me ask you really quickly. This is a bit of a two-parter. One, you mentioned the prosecutor looking into this is from the Eastern District of Missouri. Is that in of itself somewhat unusual that you are bringing a prosecutor very far removed away from the trappings of Washington, the inner workings of this particular investigation from the beginning, to have a look at it?
Yeah, that's a great point, Eamon, because it is. And that's part of what has raised a lot of people's antenna about this. It's very similar to what Attorney General Barr did in terms of tapping the U.S. attorney in Connecticut to to investigate the origins of the Russia investigation. This is not something that people I've talked to said is typical, that typically if there's an issue, say you thought something may not have happened correctly in the Flynn case or in the handling of his interview by these two FBI agents, then you would first go to the FBI. There are systems in place within the Justice Department. There's an inspector general within the FBI. There are offices that are tasked with looking into what may or may not have gone wrong. So to reach outside into the field is unusual in and of itself.
All right, Carol, stay with me because I want to bring in now former federal prosecutors Gene Rossi and Paul Butler and New York Times political reporter Nick Confessori. I want to ask our former federal prosecutors, first of all, to give me their takes. Paul, let me begin with you. Give me your take on William Barr's decision here to open an investigation essentially into the FBI.
Yeah, so this is part of a pattern. There are investigations of people who are perceived as the president's enemies, like Andrew McCabe, Hillary Clinton, James Comey. When those investigations are done in good faith and they clear the names of those people, Barr and Trump order do-overs. And so today we learn that Barr has appointed some random prosecutor from St. Louis to look at the Michael Flynn guilty plea, to look at the Michael Flynn trial. Well, Michael Flynn pled guilty. He put his hand up and swore under oath that he committed crimes. There's no legal reason to re-examine this case. It's purely another example of Barr weaponizing the awesome power of the Justice Department to carry out Trump's partisan politics.
Gene, let me get that specific bit that Paul raised, which is about the fact that Michael Flynn raised his hand and said, I am guilty of what you're accusing me of doing. It seems that, I don't know, and you know the legal system better than I do, but how rare is it that the government comes to somebody who says, hey, I committed a crime, and they'll say, actually, you know what, we're going to reinvestigate this. Something doesn't look right about why you committed this crime and why you agreed or pled guilty to committing this crime?
That's a softball question. Let me tell you what a guilty plea hearing is. And Professor Paul Butler can tell you the same thing. When a defendant goes into a guilty plea hearing, they raise their hand and under oath, they say, I'm guilty. And here's the crucial part. Michael Flynn had one of the best law firms in the country, Covington and Burling, representing him. And more important, there was a statement of facts that Michael Flynn signed. And when I did hundreds, thousands of guilty pleas, either myself or supervised in my 30 years with DOJ, that person, that defendant signs that. And that statement of facts becomes a confession that can be used in a trial if Mr. Flynn withdraws from the plea. So if his plea is vacated, removed, it's a Pyrrhic victory, because if he goes to trial, and he'd be a moron if he did, the statement of facts that he agreed to at his guilty plea will be Exhibit 1 of the government. That's how a guilty plea hearing is. It's rare that a defendant withdraws from a guilty plea, and it's doubly rare that a judge will allow it.
So, Nick, let me bring you into this conversation. I want to play you this soundbite from William Barr. Essentially, what I think, and this is my opinion, seems to contradict himself. But first, watch. He says he's not influenced by President Trump.
I came in to serve as Attorney General. The thing I have most responsibility for are the issues that are brought to me for decision. And I will make those decisions based on what I think is the right thing to do, and I'm not going to be bullied or influenced by anybody.
Now, this is the same guy who also in that interview said that the president's tweeting is making his job impossible. So if you kind of read those two statements in the same interview, on one hand, he's like, hey, he can tweet whatever he wants. He can say whatever he wants. If that's the case, then why is he also, by his own words, saying that he's not under any kind of influence?
It's hard to square, Eamon, right? And it's obvious that he has taken decisions that seem to be in response to the president's tweets and outrages over time. What he has done here now is effectively install a layer of political oversight on the same department he actually leads. He's the boss. There are procedures in place. There's actually an IG. There are ways to investigate wrongdoing by prosecutors. He is putting these extra people out there who report back to him. It gives him some control. And I think there's two audiences for it. The first audience is President Trump. And the second audience is line prosecutors who are involved in ongoing cases against other friends of the president or ongoing sentencing decisions. And that sends a chilling message to them.
Yes.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.